highly influential MAGA-stroke right-wing influencers have turned out to be directly being funded, albeit unwittingly, by Russia. Let's talk about it. Now, it's a fact of modern geopolitics that the political leaders of a number of countries take it upon themselves to seek to influence in one way or another the outcome of other countries' elections or alternative leadership selection processes. Sometimes this is done in the open and legitimately. Barack Obama expressing the opinion that Britons would be better not to vote for Brexit, for instance. Now, his intervention was not welcomed. It would have been counterproductive if it had managed to be important enough to have any kind of impact. But there it was. That's the who cares end of the scale. The bit where it really bites is where it involves covert action, destabilising tactics and all the rest of it. We've seen it in previous recent US elections with Russia and China and North Korea seeking to have influence. It's become difficult to even discuss, thanks to the very polarisation that, ironically, some of these actors seek to promote. So in the wake of Trump's 2016 election victory, shell-shocked Democrats were so utterly convinced that this couldn't have happened without Russian support, they posited not only that Russia had been seeking to boost Trump's candidacy in various ways, which was true, although the evidence suggested not particularly to any great effect, but they had to go one further and insist that it was done with Donald Trump's collusion, and that led to a long fishing expedition reported blow by a rather obviously partisan media, but ultimately finding nothing. Now, unfortunately, some Republican supporters will simply dismiss any discussion of the very real interference being run by America's enemies as more of the same. The Russian collusion hoax part 2, and dismiss it out of hand without even engaging with tedious things such as facts. Right now, what we're picking up from intelligence reports is that, not particularly surprisingly, America's enemies are actively seeking to interfere. We have got the news that might at first glance seem surprising, but isn't really, because different countries have different strategic interests, which is that different enemies are pushing for diametrically opposed American election outcomes. So Russia is said to favour a Trump victory this year. While Putin is wary of Trump as something of a loose cannon, his scepticism on the topic of funding Ukraine, unsurprisingly, wins favour. That said, Russia most often simply promotes chaos and division more than it goes in for a linear approach to a specific outcome. Either candidate, in their view, in charge of a deeply divided and unstable country would be weaker than a candidate in charge of a united one. On the other hand, you have Iran, which favours, reportedly, a Kamala victory. Trump was very pro-Israel as president, helping to kickstart the process of Arab nations recognising Israel despite the wishes of the Palestinians. He also ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, which the Iranian leadership has not forgotten nor forgiven. Iran has been identified as responsible for a series of hacks and fake websites pushing disinformation. Indeed, a couple of months ago, the Biden administration revealed that it had obtained intelligence about an Iranian assassination plot against Trump, which had nothing to do, by the way, with the actual attempt against Trump that fortunately failed. Now we have had a new event, which has rather lit up Twitter and other social media thanks to its connection with a number of well-known MAGA-friendly influencers. For those that have missed it, the story is this. The Russian propaganda channel Russia Today, banned in numerous countries as a tool of Kremlin misinformation, including in the United States, the UK, the EU, has been identified as having paid unwitting influencers to spread messages favoured by Russia. On Wednesday this week, the US Justice Department published an indictment against 2 employees of RT, for a program where they secretly, generously funded influencer videos attracting millions of views. Konstantin Kalashnikov and Elena Afansieva have been charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering and conspiracy to violate the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They're accused of channeling around $10 million through Tenet Media, a company started and run by Lauren Chen, formerly known as Roaming Millennial, and her husband. The funding was masked through shell companies in places like Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Mauritius, with the money being falsely attributed to payments for electronics. Tenet Media describes itself as a network of heterodox commentators that focus on Western political and cultural issues. It produces content for YouTube and Instagram and TikTok, etc., and works with influencers such as Benny Johnson, Tim Pool, Lauren Southern, and Dave Rubin. What is explicitly stated in the indictment is that at least two, and for all we know, all of the influencers concerned were misled as to the source of the funding for the contracts that they took on. A number of the influencers have stated as much. Benny Johnson and Tim Pool, for instance, both describe themselves as victims of the scheme. Possibly not entirely how you would normally describe someone who took shed loads of cash without running much in the way of due diligence. But their point is that they were unwitting agents, and that doesn't seem to be disputed in the indictment. In fact, the indictment explicitly points out that the influencers were told that the sponsorship was being provided by a private investor, Edward Grigorian, which is a fictional persona. The operation reflected changing realities in how Russia and RT, as its agent, is going about spreading its influence, because it had been, in the past, very much focused on a network of bots and troll accounts, which usually had rather limited followings. Now, that wasn't seen to be very effective. So this approach now seeks to support existing susceptible social media super spreader accounts with a reach in the millions. The influencers said that they made the content they chose to make. They had full editorial independence. Tim Pool has been vigorous in many of his videos, attacking Ukraine as a supposed enemy of the United States, arguing that, quote, "we should apologise to Russia." That may all have been his own idea. It's not exactly incompatible with the principle that this messaging would suit the Kremlin to boost its reach and its impact. Johnson has been talking about stopping aid for Ukraine. Reportedly, he was paid, are you ready for this? He was paid $400,000 per month, and that after accepting a golden hello payment of $100,000. The influencer, now identified as Dave Rubin, reportedly said that he would need $5 million annually for him to be interested in taking part. It's a staggering amount of money for some content creation. Enough, you might say, to strongly discourage the creator concerned from being too stringent and curious with their due diligence. The Russian operatives would, the indictment details, sometimes request specific messaging to go out in some of the content. For example, Ofaneshyeva told Tenet Media that they should blame Ukraine for the Crocus City Hall terrorist attack, even though there was zero evidence of their involvement, and ISIS had already claimed responsibility. Apparently, Lauren Chen replied that one of the influencers had confirmed that he was happy to cover it. Now, I haven't seen anything identifying a consequent piece of content that made that specific claim. If it exists, wasn't removed instantly before people had picked up on it all, no doubt we will get to hear about it in due course. But the point is the request was made and in principle agreed to. For the most part, though, it seemed that generally the Kremlin funding was simply fine to amplify the natural messaging put out by this network of individuals. And look, in a politically vigorous election period, this stuff is meat and drink for activists. They would argue it's not just legitimate, but an essential part of democracy. Nevertheless, highly divisive, constant drip feed of the worst caricatures of the other side, everything that passes for what I hold to be the worst of American politics, which applies on both sides of the modern day scene. It's just that this particular operation was boosted by the Kremlin. Now, the indictment concludes with this. While the views expressed in the videos are not uniform, the subject matter and content of the videos are often consistent with the government of Russia's interest in amplifying US domestic divisions in order to weaken opposition to core government of Russia interests, such as its ongoing war with Ukraine. Now, plenty of MAGA supporters have been lazy and quick to dismiss the whole thing as I said before, Russia collusion hoax part 2. This misses the point. Russian attempted influence was shown in previous elections. It was the Democrat hopes that there must have been direct collusion with Trump that turned out to be false. This is documented. The influencers concerned have confirmed their involvement, albeit unwittingly. We don't yet have a response from Lauren Chen or her husband or Tenet Media, so we don't know if they have any sort of defence to offer to these accusations, which explicitly report knowing collusion on the part of the company founders. At first glance, there's nowhere for them to hide. And I'm sorry to hear that. To be fair, I discovered Lauren Chen's content back when she was posting as Roaming Millennial. She had a good, distinctive voice for her perspective, and I enjoyed some of that content and wished her well. But this is a very dark place to have ended up. That to one side, this is a disaster for all of those influencers. The last thing you want, if you have become a powerful, well-known commentator with a significant-sized audience that trusts you, is to be revealed as a pawn of one of your country's enemies. Their feeds are now unsurprisingly full of people abusing them for being traitors, Putin stooges and all the rest. Some of that is likely to stick, whether it's fair or not. As one person pointed out, even if you never took direction in the things you chose to say, it really should give you pause for consideration if what you naturally say and promote as a public figure is being actively amplified by one of your country's most active enemies. I mean, that's not a conclusive criticism. I'm reminded of one of Larry Niven's laws, to wit, there is no cause so right that one cannot find a fool following it. In other words, just because Putin agrees with you doesn't automatically mean that you're wrong. It does mean, I would suggest, you should strongly reflect on what it is that is being supported and why. Ask yourself some very hard questions. One of Niven's other rules, it is easier to destroy than to create. Something that strongly comes to mind when you look at a content list like this for Tenet Media. I am deeply unattracted to political voices that don't bother to frame a coherent case for a way of being that's positive, but instead only constantly tear down, belittle and mock. They do it, of course, because social media platforms do tend to reward that sort of content. Therein lies a big problem, because just following the incentives takes you halfway there already. And foreign agents are then well versed in feeding people's already realised self-interest by getting them to betray the interests of their own country. Really does mean you should be a bit less greedy and a bit more smart when someone offers you unfeasibly large amounts of money for, a few videos.